the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello everybody, we're on the road today in Silicon Valley, in the heart of Silicon Valley, in Menlo Park, and we are with Mike Maples Jr., who's a legendary venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. He's the co-founder and partner of Floodgate Ventures, one of the top VC firms in the Valley. And not only is Mike a VC, but now he's an author. He's the co-author of a new book, Pattern Breakers, Why Some Startups Change the Future. Mike, congratulations on the book, but do we really need venture capitalists writing books for us? Aren't you powerful enough already?
Maybe not, but I guess this book came from a little bit of a different place. So sometimes venture capitalists can have a tendency to say, I have a crystal ball and I'm going to come down from the mountain and tell you what the future is. But this book was more born of mistakes and confusion and unsettling realities. And so I'd noticed that 80% of our exit profits had come from pivots. And a lot of the successes that we'd had started out as something radically different. And so trying to come to grips with that. Should I just retire before I get exposed? Was I a lucky fool? Or were there more things to understand? And so the book was an outgrowth of this journey of discovery, of trying to understand, is this all just random? Is it just wild? Or is there other forces worth understanding in what makes these great startups happen?
Is a pivot, Mike, which is a much used, perhaps overused word in Silicon Valley, is that a euphemism for a fuck up?
Well, not when it's used right. And so to me, a pivot, a good metaphor would be in basketball, you plant your pivot foot, and your pivot foot is like your insight. It's the thing you know about the future that's not obvious. And then you modify your product and you modify who you sell it to, and that's like when you're moving your body in basketball around your pivot foot. And so what a lot of people, when they say pivot, what they really mean is they want a mulligan. They just want a redo. They want a do-over. That's not what I mean by pivot. I mean by understanding what your fundamental insight is and then navigating your idea and the implementation of the idea to the right customer.
Yeah, you went sporting, you're talking about basketball. I thought you were going to go ice hockey, Mike, and talk about that famous Wayne Gretzky quote about always knowing where the puck is going rather than following it. Is that an appropriate metaphor too for what you do, trying to figure out the future?
Well, it's funny. I think that a lot of people would like to claim that, but I guess I would claim that I'm something different. I think that I am really good at understanding who's living in the future now. And so I believe that some people visit the future before the rest of us. And so in some ways, I'm really more of an expert in the present. I'm an expert in who are those people in the present world living in the future just a little bit ahead of us before the rest of us discover it. So I am very skeptical of my ability to know where the puck's going, much less skate to it.
But of course, you're in the business of trying to figure out the future, even if you're living in the present. There's that famous quote about the future existing but not being fully distributed yet. Do you buy that idea?
I do. So yeah, that quote is William Gibson, right? The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. I 100% agree with that. So when the browser was invented, Mark Andreessen was a student at the University of Illinois tinkering with the technologies of the internet or the World Wide Web, And it had just been legal for businesses to even use the internet. And so he was living in the future before the rest of us. Time and again, I see that's where a lot of the really great startups happen. Twitch started as Justin TV, and it was Justin Kahn live casting his life all the time.
Yeah, I used to know Justin when he was Justin TV many years ago.
Yeah, and you know, Justin wanted to be an influencer before we even had a word to describe what an influencer was. And so he was living in the future. And so quite often what we find is that great startup ideas do come from that. When you live in the future, you start to notice what's new about the future, and you start to engage in new patterns of behavior that ultimately allow you to break free of the limitations of the current patterns. And that's how most of the pattern breaking startups have happened that I've seen, is the founder experiences the future just a little bit ahead of the rest of us.
Almost accidentally, the full title of your new book, which you co-wrote with Peter Ziebelman, is Pattern Breakers: Why Some Startups Change the Future. Mike, getting to definitions, I'm not going to ask you yet for a definition of pattern breaker, but what is the future? Easy question, of course.
Yeah, well, depending. There's really two ways to look at it. Most people think of the future as an extension of the present. And so they forecast, they project forward from what's known, and they assume that the future tomorrow will look similar to the present of today with a few modifications. But then there's other people who think that the future will be radically different from the present, that it'll be almost unrecognizable, and that by definition we have to work backwards, we have to backcast from radically different futures. And what I've learned and what formed a lot of the premises of the book was that usually the default is forecasting, and usually the default is that means the incumbents win. They have a lot of advantages. They have power, they have customers, they have a brand, they have products, they have markets already, all these things. Startups don't win when they forecast. They win when they backcast. They win when they change the subject, when the future is radically different. And so business is never a fair fight. The only question is who gets to fight unfair. And that's how I look at the future, is what type of future are we pursuing here? I think some futures are more suited to startups, some futures are more suited to incumbents.
One of the great issues, Mike, when it comes to technology and our technological future is human agency, whether we really are shaping the future or whether there's something inevitable about it. Are you suggesting that entrepreneurs have a kind of agency and that some futures may happen, others won't, and that there's always these potential paths? When someone pitches you, if they never get funding, then that future simply won't happen?
Yeah, well, you know, some people talk about the future as if it happens to us, and then there are others who think it happens because of us, and I'm a little bit more in the latter camp. And so I think that most new futures happen because someone was original enough to have an idea about a different future that was radically different, that broke free from the limits of how most people think. But then not only did they do that, not only did they think different, they act different. They have to persuade people to move to that different future with them. And that's hard to do, because even if you're right about a different future, you're just sitting in the future by yourself. You've got to convince other people to join that future with you. And so I would say in those two ways, the founders take very active agency for defining the future they want and then realizing it in the real world.
Mike, you mentioned William Gibson earlier, one of the great science fiction writers. Also a very gifted historian, a man who's rooted in history. To do the future properly, to shape the future, to profit, to win the future, do you think you have to be a good historian?
Not necessarily. In fact, I think that a lot of people who invent the future almost feel guilty about it. When you say, how did you come up with this idea? They feel guilty about it. And quite often what I find is that they are just obsessed with a certain new field. They're tinkering with some new type of technology, and quite often they're exploring the boundaries of it just for its own sake. A lot of the people around them often think, this is a useless waste of time, why are you doing this? And so when they come up with these secrets about the future, secrets that they earn ultimately, they almost feel guilty for how they got them, because people expected them to have a crystal ball or to be contrarian somehow. But quite often they just explored the fractals of knowledge of what they were interested in and just opened a new fractal that nobody had seen before.
Do you have particular entrepreneurs who you look up to? I mean, you've invested in some of them, but the most iconic, of course, and Steve Jobs in the Valley, now Elon Musk, you mentioned Mark Andreessen, Jeff Bezos, of course. Is there someone who, for you, captures all the potential of a pattern breaker?
Well, I think that there are a lot who've been great pattern breakers for different reasons. I think obviously Elon Musk would have to be high on the list because he's done things that wouldn't have happened but for his presence in the industry, right? We probably wouldn't have electric cars the way we know them without Tesla and Elon's contributions to Tesla surviving. Certainly we wouldn't be as close as we are to advancing the frontiers of space. Space had been pretty stagnant for a while. And so now Elon is not going to be for everybody. He's not going to be everybody's best friend. He's not always going to be super agreeable. But if I were to define someone who personifies pattern breaking, I'd say he's high on the list. I would say, Jobs is obviously one. I think Brian Chesky has been really effective. I think Justin was good for different reasons. All of them have different ways of showing up in the world. And this is the other thing I've learned about great founders is they tend to be very authentic to the future that they're pursuing. And so they're passionate about the idea that they're obsessed with. And quite often, the type of founder who embodies that idea takes very different forms.
You mentioned Musk and you used the word disagreeable. The penultimate chapter in the book, Pattern Breakers, is be disagreeable. And of course, it's a book in some ways of advice to startup entrepreneurs. It's be disagreeable and not a jerk. Now, there are many people, perhaps even in this office, who believe that Elon Musk is a jerk. What's the difference, Mike, between being disagreeable and being a jerk?
Sure. So first of all, a startup that wants to break free of the present is by definition disagreeable. It's a disagreeable act. It's saying that the way things are done now isn't the best way, that there's a different way that's superior. And so you have to have a different idea, and that's a form of disagreeableness. But then in order to make that idea real, sometimes you have to act disagreeably. So a good example would be the Lyft guys when they launched an illegal service in San Francisco. So had they asked the San Francisco government for permission, they would have certainly been outlawed before they would have just been denied permission. They would have been never allowed to launch. And so they realized we have to have people fall in love with this service, and then we'll talk to the San Francisco government when there's a bunch of people who love this, and now we're able to have a discussion about what should the law really be, how do we get the law changed. And so if you cared too much about not ruffling feathers, if you cared too much about keeping the peace, you wouldn't have launched it illegally. And most people in society probably wouldn't have done that. Most people would have thought that that's going too far. And so to me, that's a good example of acting in a disagreeable way. I think sometimes, though, people conflate disagreeableness with just being gratuitously hostile to folks. And I don't think that's good. I think that most people who act that way, if they succeed in spite of it. And so, to me, not being disagreeable when you need to be is a form of inauthenticity, but also being a gratuitous jerk is a form of inauthenticity. And what we should seek to be is more authentic to the mission that we're pursuing, realizing that there's this balance, that we have to know that sometimes the status quo is going to try to get us to agree against our interests and against the mission's interests. And there are other times where we need to keep our temper and our tendencies in check because it's going to hold us back in achieving the goal.
Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that you just said that being disagreeable is breaking the law and kind of getting away with it. That's what the Lyft guys did. That's what the YouTube guys did. I don't know whether you ever got pitched YouTube back in 2005 and 6, but I think most people would accept now that they that they allowed a lot of stolen content on their network. They got up, they made online video acceptable, and then they became legal. Some people would suggest that AI companies like OpenAI are doing the same thing now, downloading the entire web, and then everyone will catch up with them. It's what Mark Zuckerberg, of course, described as break things and move fast. Is that what you're saying? That you have to break things, that you have to move fast, and even if you break the law and make a success of your company, that's acceptable?
Yeah, so this is all a really good point. So let me give an example of what I think would not be acceptable, and then I think there's a range, right? So you gave a lot of examples, some of which are, I would argue, more problematic than others. So, for example, and you had a guest on one of your prior shows, Tim O'Reilly, where he talked about what happens if an AI company can take a news article and summarize it well enough that the person reading it would never feel the need to consume the original source article. It would be a perfect substitute for that article. Well, you could see why that would be a problem, because you're extracting value and not creating enough additive value in the world, right? You're basically stealing that person's content. That's bad in my view, but that's breaking a pattern in a way that I don't think is making the future legitimately better. I think that that's just playing games and extracting value from the other guy. But I think that in the case of Lyft, they legitimately believed that ride sharing was superior to the experience of taxis in San Francisco, and it turns out a lot of people agreed with them, and so they were willing to have that discussion in public. They were willing to say, look, I'm not saying that I'm not breaking the law. I'm just saying that the law needs to be changed. Here's why, and here's why the world will be a better place if we do this. And so I think that there's a spectrum, and I think that the types of founders that I appreciate the most are those who are more driven by creating abundance than by just disruption for its own sake. And so, you know, the best founders I've seen really do believe in an aesthetically better future, and they want to make that aesthetically different future happen in the real world, and they do it, they come by it honestly, and if it means they break some glass along the way, for me that's more acceptable than for someone who is just trying to extract value from someone else just to line their own pockets and kind of hide behind the flag, if you will, of being a pattern breaker, or hide behind the flag, if you will, of being a visionary. You
mentioned the Lyft guys. Yep. None of them actually come to mind for me. You invested in them and you know who they are. And of course, we could compare and contrast them with Travis Kalanick. I've known Travis for years. I just rather liked him, even if he was obviously a rather obnoxious character. He's become one of the pin-up bad boys of Silicon Valley. Would you, in your mind, contrast a Kalanick with Lyft? They're doing the same things, but they went about it in very different kinds of ways.
You know, I'm probably a little bit more sympathetic than people might expect when it comes to Travis. So he was a ruthless competitor. He was no fun to compete with, for sure. But, you know, when you requested an Uber ride, did a car come? Yep. Did it take you where you're supposed to go? Yep. Did it work in a lot of cities? Yes. Did the drivers get paid? Yes. Did the riders get the transportation they wanted? Yes. And so he created a different future that really worked. He delivered on the type of future that he wanted to create. Now, he engaged in a lot of tactics that were, you know, tested the boundaries for sure. But I have a lot less problem with somebody like Travis than that guy who was going to put on the Fry Festival and it was a hoax.
Yeah, well, he was a criminal.
Right. So I have the problem I have is with people who use their storytelling and their charisma to tell a fake story, the people who are a false messiah. Whereas I think that what Travis was trying to do was real, and you can argue and quibble with his tactics, and he does some things that I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but in the end, he was a real entrepreneur creating real value and a real future. And so I think that he was probably unfairly personified as like a bad entrepreneur somehow, or unethical entrepreneur. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that.
The old question, or the question that everyone always asks VCs, I'm sure you get sick of being asked this question, is do you invest in the idea or the individual? In other words, are individuals or ideas, are they the core pattern breakers in terms of changing the future?
Yeah, so I would say that like the idea basically describes how high the ceiling can be. So a better idea has more upside, can get bigger if everything goes right. But I would say the founder is more important in the sense that the founder defines how high at a maximum the startup can go, right? So if you had to pick one or the other, I'd pick a better founder, but ideas really do matter in terms of their power to change the future. So if you have an idea that is too much like what's come before, you're only going to incrementally succeed within the rules that have already been defined by the incumbents. What you want to do is pursue an idea that can't be reconciled with anything that's happened before, and then you want to have a founder who has the capabilities, the persuasion skills, and the vision and the passion to go make that a reality and convince other believers to follow them. So they're both really important. And here's where I think there's a little bit of a false dichotomy. The very best founders know it's important to pursue a great idea. And so to some degree, if a founder is pursuing a not so great idea, it causes you to second guess how good the founder really was in the first place.
So obviously it takes both. You were an early investor in Twitter when it was known as Twitter. Now, of course, it's Elon Musk's X. Were you investing in the idea of Twitter or in entrepreneurs proven entrepreneurs like Ev Williams and Jack Dorsey? Jack Dorsey at the time was less proven. What does Twitter tell us, your investment, your experience with Twitter, about pattern breaking?
Well, to some degree, it was helped precipitate why I did this analysis, because I started out, I invested in a company called Audio, which was a podcasting company.
Right, which was Ev Williams's.
Yeah, it was Ev's, and then it went out of business, and he gave all the investors their money back. And I said, look, you don't owe me anything. Can I invest it in your next thing? And he said, well, Jack has this idea. We're going to call it TWTTR or Voicemail 2.0. And I thought, okay, well, what does it do? And he says, well, you say what you're doing. And I said, okay, what happens after that? And he says, that's it. That's all it does. 140 characters or less. What's the roadmap? There is no roadmap. What's the revenue model? There is no revenue model. And so
when was this, about 2005?
This would have been, good memory. So it's a little bit later than that. So it's probably about late 2006, early 2007. And so I said, hey, I think I want to invest in whatever your next thing is. And he said, well, it's not a company right now, but I'll let you know if it ever is one. And then it blew up at South by Southwest. And one day Ev calls me and says, did you mean it when you said you wanted to invest? And by then I thought I probably lost out on it, that it had drifted away, that it was becoming a hot thing. And he said, because if you meant that, now is the time. And so they let me invest back in the summer of 2007. And so I would like to say that I understood the future, but it was really more of a bet on those founders and just their insight about short form tweets, and they already had some attention and momentum. And so I was in this lucky position of having known them, and I suppose having built a good enough relationship to earn the right to invest when the time came.
Coming back to Twitter, the subtitle of your book is Why Some Startups Change the Future. When you got that call from Ev Williams in late 2006, 2007, when Twitter took off at that infamous moment at South by Southwest, did you have any idea, Mike, of how Twitter X might change the future? Now we have more and more popular or populist movements suggesting that X should be banned or children shouldn't be allowed on it. Did you grasp it in any way? Did you understand your role in creating the future? Although probably Ev would have got money from someone else, but you were still influencing the future by investing in it.
Yeah, I suppose. I don't think that I had any idea how big it was going to get. The ones that work really well, there's just no way you can possibly imagine how big they will get. And there's some that I've passed on, like Air Bed and Breakfast, which became Airbnb. And if you had told me it was going to be $100 billion company, I would have just, there was no world that I could have imagined in the future where that would have been true. And so usually these things, when they work and when they do change the future, they run a lot farther than you could have ever imagined. It's hard to imagine the future before it happens. It's hard to imagine how big these things can be. And so most of my failures have been a failure of imagination.
But if you had the imagination, I want to come back to it.
Yeah, sure.
But if you had the imagination to invest in Lyft which allowed anyone to use their car as a cab, why wouldn't you have the imagination to invest in Airbnb, which was really just an extension, using your house as a hotel?
It's a good question, and I might not have had I. So we foolishly passed on Air Bed and Breakfast in 2008, and I thought, this is just too crazy. Like, who's going to want to stay in a stranger's house? And at the time, the host and the guest would stay at the same time, and the host would feed the guest Pop-Tarts, and they'd sleep on an air mattress, the guest would. And so I thought, this is kind of crazy. And so by the time we met the Zimride guys, which ended up becoming Lyft, the idea that somebody would ride in a stranger's car, I was like, I might be willing to take that bet this time. Last time I said no, I thought it was crazy, and now I was starting to see that Airbnb was starting to take off. Maybe this could happen. And so fortunately, it was our failure of imagination with Airbnb that probably gave us the imagination to invest in what became Lyft.
Do you always have to make bets as a VC in a single company as opposed to a category? I'm guessing that you couldn't have invested in both Lyft and Uber.
It would have been hard because these startups are very emotional, and they're very the status quo fights back, and people tell them their ideas are stupid. And I think in the early stages, when you invest, the founders need a different type of help. They need co-conspirators, and so it's kind of hard to be a co-conspirator and then go invest in their competitor. So I would say typically you kind of pick the one that you want to invest in, and part of what makes it hard is you don't know if you pick the right one because you can't see them all in advance necessarily, and so you kind of have to make a bet on the founders and the idea, and you hope that that's going to be the best one.
Speaking generally to VCs, we've had many on the show in the past, Mike, they all say, well, we never regret missing an opportunity because that's in the nature of the business. But I sense perhaps a little bit of regret in missing Airbnb. Do you sometimes wake up at 3 in the morning and think to yourself, why didn't I invest in that one?
Yeah, I do a different type of investing, right? I don't invest in corporations the way Warren Buffett does. And Buffett would say, rule number 1, don't lose money. Rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1. In my business, I invest in startup capitalists. And rule number 1 is don't pass on Airbnb. And so if you say yes to Airbnb, you make many thousands of times your money. And if you say yes to one that doesn't work, you can only lose 1 time your money. And so where you fail to succeed in venture is failing to anticipate the potential upside of a crazy idea or a crazy sounding idea. So whenever we pass on a startup that we should have said yes to, we go back and we create a time capsule of everything that there was to know at the time you had to decide. And I have this database of what I call 100 baggers. I study all of the startups where you would have made more than 100x your money, and I want to understand exactly what it looked like at the time you would have had to invest in the seed round. What was the founder like at that time? What was the product at that time? What was the pitch deck at that time? Because it's easy to misremember how it happened, especially when it's successful. People tend to remember knowing things they didn't really know, and so you're trying to understand as best you can the embryonic, early, crazy conditions that define the startup back then.
All that data is all very well, Mike, but aren't the good VCs or the great VCs, aren't they like the great startup entrepreneurs, people of instinct, obsessive types who are hard to replicate?
There's probably some truth to that, but I think that there's also a curiosity that the great ones have. And so I think that the best venture people that I've known, and there's a ton of people in the venture business, and there is a very wide variance in quality and personality in the people involved. But the people that I've admired the most always feel like they could be better, always feel like they could know more, always feel like the truth is just slightly closer in grasp. And all the great investors I've known read a lot, are super curious, are almost like You know, you might have seen that British movie Train Spotting, where
Yes.
you know, you get all these old guys in these anorak coats tracking the comings and goings of trains. The best venture people I know are that way when it comes to startups. They're like curious about startups in a way that seems unreasonable or maybe even uninteresting or maybe even socially awkward to most people.
Think about sports when it comes to my particular sport, soccer, football. It's very hard. It's very rare to be a manager, a successful manager, without being a good player, although often the great players don't make good managers, and some of the best managers are rather mediocre players. You mentioned Mark Andreessen earlier. Unusual, and he was a brilliant entrepreneur and also one of the leading venture capitalists now in Silicon Valley. Do you think being an entrepreneur, even if you're a failed entrepreneur, does that help as a venture capitalist?
I think it probably does, but I don't think it's a guarantee. I like your example of soccer because it has this intersection. I don't know if you've read Mike Moritz's book, the one that he wrote with Sir
Alex.
Yeah, and so I really like that
And
book.
Mike Moritz, of course, was another iconic venture capitalist, invested in Yahoo and Google back in the 90s, a Sequoia Capital partner.
You could argue that Mike is one of the best, if not the best, venture capitalists on a consistent basis for a very long time. And I really like this book about Sir Alex because at the end of the book, he talks about this idea that Sir Alex, there was never enough trophies that he won, but he wasn't trying to brag about how many trophies he won. He was competing with the very idea of perfection itself. And the very best in any field believe that there's a way to always get better, believe that perfection, it may not be attainable, but it's worth chasing. And so I would say that that's the best venture capitalists are that way. And if you have an entrepreneurial background that contributes to your pursuit of that, that's good. But I would say that it is your passion for the craft of knowing what makes a great opportunity, what makes a great founder, and always knowing that it's possible to just relentlessly pursue the idea of perfection itself when it comes to that. So just like Sir Alex, right? He's not just keeping track of the number of games that they win. He's trying to understand what perfect soccer would look like and how to get as close as he can to that, how to embody that in the way that he coaches the team.
The remarkable thing, of course, about Sir Alex is not only was he perhaps the most successful manager in history, but in contrast to so many other enormously successful people, he also knew when to retire. It's an important, relevant subject today, and when we're still not quite sure, maybe when people watch this, Joe Biden will have made a decision one way or the other. Timing is everything, Mike, isn't it? Not only in terms of when you hang up your boots or your entrepreneurial spurs, but also in terms of investment.
Yep, I think that's right. And the way I look at it is, like when I was a kid, my dad used to say to me, do your best. And when you think about it, that's not just a platitude, right? There's only one you in this world. And the best you can ever do is your best, literally. And so I think that the time that you retire is when you no longer can commit to doing your best, both in your own mind and in the reality of how you show up in the world. And so where I think a lot of people run into problems is when they can't do their best anymore, but they miss the adulation or the fame or the trappings of the job. And so they can't be intellectually honest about the fact that they can no longer do their best. And so that's when I'll know it's time to stop, because I love the job, right? I would do it whether I made lots of money or didn't. But I just, the day that I no longer care about showing up and doing my best is the day I'll know it's time to stop. And I think that too many people, unfortunately, didn't learn that lesson. You know, they want to go a little bit past the length of time that they should.
How did you get into it?
Almost by accident. So I'd been a founder, and I thought I was going to maybe start another company. And some people said, hey, have you ever thought about venture? And so I only spent time inside of venture firms just to learn about it, but I never had any notion that I would be a venture capitalist. And it just became so interesting to me that I just couldn't not do it.
And the third chapter in your book is timing is everything. But of course, a lot of it's accidental, isn't it? No one really, I mean, maybe Sir Alex knew he was a genius, but most of us are not aware of how we time things.
I think that's right, but the corollary to that is that people with prepared minds, they attract luck. And so Louis Pasteur, who's a famous scientist, was constantly accused of getting lucky because he would have a lot of these semi-accidental discoveries. And on his gravestone, his epitaph said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." And a lot of people think that these insights or these ideas or these breakthroughs come like a streak of lightning, like the apple falling on Newton's head when he came up with gravity. But I think that a better way to think about it is the reason that happened with Isaac Newton is he was thinking about those ideas all the time. And so prepared minds who are pursuing an obsession, that are pushing the frontiers of knowledge, that are interested in a way that's, radically ahead of most of us, are more likely to notice things. They're going to see things that others don't see. They're more likely to notice it when they see it. And they're more likely to attract other believers because of the authenticity. And so I think that chance does favor the prepared mind. And as I was starting to work on the ideas of this book, I understood what Pasteur really meant for the first time. And so I do think you can be the type of person that attracts luck. I don't think there's a recipe for breakthroughs, but I do think that there's a mindset that people can adopt that makes them much more likely to get lucky.
Do you think that the venture capital industry is the best one to change the future, or at least invest in the future? It's a very young industry. It really began in the 1950s and 60s. Lots of people, including my friend Keith Teare, who I do a weekly That Was the Week podcast with, believe that AI and data is going to change your own industry, that you're funding now all these AI companies and they will come to eat you in your industry.
Well, that might happen, and I think that you don't want to get in the way of the future. Having said that, I do think that venture is a pretty unique type of business, and so most businesses, if you invest in the stock market or if you invest in bonds, or you have these what we call normally distributed returns. Most people do sort of average, and then some people do one standard deviation better, some people do one standard deviation worse, and so on. But in venture, usually the best company in a given year is worth more than all the other tens of thousands of companies started that year combined. And usually the best company of a decade is more valuable than all the other companies started that decade combined. And so venture is like a lottery game where a small number of people seem to keep getting the winning tickets. And so as long as it's not random who spots those outliers and who gets access to those outliers, I think there will be a venture business. Now, some might say that AI is going to be able to pick those companies, but then quite often the founders still value taking money from the venture capitalists, because if a venture capitalist has a reputation like, say, Mike Moritz, it's valuable to the company. It helps with recruiting, it helps with fundraising in the future. And so I think that because great success is so rare, the credential of having a quality investor matters more. Like if I'm the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, I don't care as much who buys my stock as long as people are buying it. But if I'm an entrepreneur starting a startup and I have wildly high ambitions, I do care about who my venture capitalist is, because it's a signal. It's kind of like what university I went to. It matters in terms of your ability to attract the best people. And
of course, Keith's startup is called Signal Rank, and it's a way of using AI to evaluate smart investment. Why not just have data, Mike? If you'd have had infinite data back when the Lyft guys or Ed Williams wandered into your office to fund Twitter or Twitch or Lyft, would that have enabled you to be a smarter VC, or is the idea of data ultimately, when it comes to these huge wins, really beside the point?
I think it depends on where you play and when you play. The challenge for us when we invest is we're investing too early, way too early, or legally ambiguously too early. And so there is no data about the performance of the company. We don't know what the economics of the business are yet. We don't know how much it's going to cost to get a customer. We don't know how much it's going to create value in terms of the lifetime value of a customer. So there's a whole bunch of things that people can normally analyze that can't be analyzed. So I suppose we could use data to keep track of who's likely to be a good founder someday, but that's a pretty broad aperture of people to consider because a lot of those people will never start something. So I would say that data is important. We're always looking at ways to use it to make our business better. We're always open to the idea that it's tempting to say, hey, we're artists, data doesn't matter. But I think it's also true that there is a little bit of art to this, right? There is some art as well as some science to it, and I haven't seen a lot of evidence in the last couple of decades that that's gone away.
So the title of your last proper chapter in the book is Dancing Elephants, which suggests that large companies can also dance and have the agility and the ability to change the future as much as startups. It seems as if, Mike, something has changed in our AI age, that most of the companies now changing the future aren't little startups like YouTube or Twitch or Twitter or Lyft. It's the biggest players, Microsoft, who invested enormously in OpenAI. Even OpenAI is a massively multi-billion-dollar funded company. Google, Amazon, of course. Has something changed? Has the romance of the couple of kids in a garage up the road, like the Google founders, has that gone away now? And you need such massive amounts of capital. Even the smallest AI startups like Anthropic require billions of dollars of investment.
Yes, there's a few things to unpack there. So first of all, I do think that there are a set of startups that do need a great amount of capital. And I haven't invested in those types because I look at those as almost like someday divisions of big tech companies. We just don't know which one yet. But it's in some ways they're outsourcing the function of R&D and new products in a big tech company to these robustly funded startup companies. But I would say that they operate more like small versions of a big company than startups. To me, a startup, by definition, has to try to light a forest fire with just a single match. And it's a testament to the startup's true power to change the future that it can do it with minimal resources. If startups could change the future only with a lot of resources, there'd be no reason for startups to ever win. They win because they refuse the premise of the current rules. They deny the premise of the rules. They impose new rules. And part of how they do that is they win by changing the future and by having a different insight about the future rather than by going faster, bigger, spending more than the incumbents. And so I think we're in a world right now where the incumbents are really good. Some of the startups are very well funded, but I don't think it's crowding out the opportunity for real startups to be capital efficient and to change the future in the way they always have.
You use and if it's a metaphor, Mike, of a single match causing a forest fire. It might be chilling to some people given the current climate situation. Some people believe that venture capitalists need to be more socially responsible and that they should be investing in technologies, for example, to address global warming, technologies to address inequality, technologies to address the loneliness epidemic. How do you feel about that when startups wander into your office and pitch you? Are the social and political consequences, are they significant? Should they be?
Well, so a couple things. First of all, I do think that there are some companies funded where I don't really understand why. Companies that even if they succeed won't necessarily make the world a better place. And so I'm not really a proponent
What
of
areas in
those.
particular were you thinking?
I would say that there have been companies, for example, that have done advertising technology that I didn't really like that much.
You mean surveillance style advertising?
Yeah, and so I'm not a big fan of that. And so I look at those and I say, okay, even if we were right, even if we made money on that, that's not something I'd be interested in. It's not how I want to show up in the world. But to me, those are the things that are more problematic. I think that actually there's a lot of money to fund all those ideas that you described. There's a lot of money that's gone into climate tech. There's a lot of money that's gone into mental health. There's a lot of money that's gone into health. Now, I don't think that we've seen the progress we'd like to see, but it's not for lack of money. We just haven't had the breakthrough ideas that have changed the future enough. But I'm optimistic that they will, and I'm optimistic the money will be there. Where I part ways with some people in the industry is more people funding things that they don't think would actually be good for the world, even if they work, but they'll make money as an investment. That's where I think there's been some unfortunate examples.
What aspect of the American future would you like startups to change that perhaps still aren't changing, where we need investment? Where would you like to see more startup initiatives, more investment, more work?
I think that if you look at society writ large and you say, what's the American dream? Most people want to own a house. Most people want to have a good education. Most people want to have good health care. Sadly, though, all three of those are outpacing the cost of inflation. So we are not gaining abundance, we're not gaining productivity, we're not gaining access to prosperity in those three areas broadly as much as we should. And so that's where I would like to see us make more progress. And I think part of the problem is we have a set of institutions that in some ways are not performing their stated role as well as they could. And so quite often the solution is to create alternatives and to create the conditions where more alternatives can happen. So for example, in the military spending, you've had 3 or 4 defense subcontractors for the last few decades, and they were the only companies bidding for these projects. So of course it's going to be expensive, of course it's going to be slow. Just the fact alone that companies like Anduril exists is good. You can disagree with any individual product that Anduril has, but still say it's good for the military to spend some % of its budget on new companies and new ideas, just as a matter of course. Same is true with the university system. I think that right now it's too hard for new colleges to get credentialed, that the old guard kind of guards that credentialing to prevent new entrants. I think that there's a lot of broken incentives. The schools are able to keep raising their prices because they keep the supply low of how many students that they educate, and then the government offers the ability to take these big loans, and so all the incentives are broken and screwed up for these universities in terms of cost effectiveness of the education that they deliver and the quality. And we could say, don't even get me started on healthcare, right? So those are the areas I'd like to see us make a big difference. And I'd like to see entrepreneurs make a difference, but I'd also like us to create the conditions where our institutions can be supplemented by new attempts. In the university system, I like the University of Austin just because it's something new and it's a new attempt to address some of the old problems. And as long as there's new ideas, it'll keep the older institutions more accountable.
Can AI be the technological pattern breaker in medicine and education in particular? Some people are deeply fearful, others believe it's the future. We've done many shows on that.
I think it's going to be very profoundly good for the most part. And so it's really the third sea change of my life in the industry. The first was mass computation and the microprocessor and Moore's law. And then you had mass connectivity and networks and communications bandwidth becoming free. And now I think we have this era of mass cognition. And so things that used to require human cognition are now going to start to become free in certain areas. And that's very profoundly good in most ways. And so in many cases, cognition will be a complement to human cognition, and it'll create empowering breakthroughs in the same way that connecting the entire world did, and in the same way that putting a computer on every desk in every home did. But there will be corresponding issues, right? The connecting everybody in the world had problems like that you pointed out in one of your books, right? The Cult of the Amateur, right? There are knock-on effects of having everybody be connected and having everybody be able to be a publisher. Those problems have to be acknowledged as well. And I'm sure the same will be true of AI, that there will be people who use AI to create deep fakes, or be people who use AI to breach the security of companies and individuals. And we can't be Pollyanna about that. We have to recognize the reality of that problem and face the problems as we move into the future, as well as hopefully harness the benefits of it.
Mike, there was that old car bumper plate, I think it was popular in Berkeley one time back in the 1970s and 80s, that a nuclear war could ruin your day. And is the same true? I take your point on the way in which AI can improve industries, vertical industries like education and the medical industry, as well as the military industry, although that area is morally controversial. But what about the fear some people have of this imminent AGI, inventing machines that will be, as somebody said in a book, our last invention? Is there any existential risk from our species' point of view of AI, in your view?
Well, I think you can never categorically say that there is no such thing. I would say, though, that I'm much more concerned about what humans might do with AI. I'm much more concerned with humans making weapons that destroy the world by other humans than I am some AI becoming super intelligent and deciding that we're useless or somehow subservient to the AI. And so I care much more about how humanity is going to use AI, and what are the boundary conditions of where that's a good thing, and what are the boundary conditions of where that's not a good thing. And the military is a really good example. On one hand, it feels bad to design weapons that are intended to kill people and that are more efficient machines at doing so. But there is a reality, right? The Chinese aren't just going to be nice to us in the future just because. And so quite often the best way to not be attacked and the best way to have peace is to have the types of weapons that make it unattractive for people to consider the possibility of doing it. And so, there are boundary conditions, but I think for the most part, I'm much more worried about bad actors doing bad things with AI than I am about the computers taking over the world and, one of these Terminator 2 kind of scenarios.
You mentioned the Chinese, Mike. TikTok, of course, is an enormously controversial company. Some people saw technology as a way of bringing the world together. What are your thoughts on, it seems like a consensus between the Democrats and the Republicans when it comes to China? Do you invest in Chinese companies? Do you have an office in China?
We haven't done a lot so far, and part of that's just because we're really small and we try to invest in things really close by. I'd say that one of the things that makes it complicated when it comes to China is they don't allow any of our platforms in China, and so how do you deal with that fact? And so that's one part of it. And part of free trade is it's a little bit like a prisoner's dilemma. If you always cooperate and the other person cheats in the prisoner's dilemma game, you always end up losing. And so the prisoner's dilemma game works when both sides cooperate. And in the other cases, if one side cooperates, the other one doesn't, the non-cooperative side wins. And so we've been through a couple of decades where, from a trade point of view, specifically in these tech social platforms, China's just been uncooperative, and we need to decide what to do about that. And then I think there's kind of this other angle to TikTok, which is it a tool of Chinese propaganda, or is it trying to create unrest? And there's a lot of evidence that perhaps that's true. And so I think that's another valid concern. I wonder sometimes how relevant the discussion is, because I'm not sure it is going to get banned in the U.S. Everybody talks about it, everybody saber rattles, both parties bipartisanly agree, but I don't know about you, I didn't see it getting shut down anytime recently. And it seems like if something was going to happen, it would have happened by now. So I wouldn't be surprised if it takes longer for it to shut down than most people believe it will. Could be wrong, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Coming to moral qualms as a VC, did you ever get pitched Peter Thiel's Palantir company? Do you have moral qualms about investing in AI associated with warfare or surveillance?
I don't, if I believe that it's going to be intended for upholding Western values and freedom and protecting freedom. The problem is if you don't invest in those things, or if those things aren't built.
Well, that's kind of given. Everyone says that, don't they? I mean,
I think so.
Say they're against Western freedom when they pitch it.
Yeah, but for example, you could say, I'm against the NSA bugging every citizen of the United States. That I think that passes a boundary condition that's unacceptable. And I would be, if I was involved in Palantir as an investment, I'm not. If they were involved in that somehow, I would do my best as an investor to exercise my opinion about, I don't think this is where we should be going. I don't think this is what we invested in. But I think that if you just, one of the problems of saying I'll never invest in a military company, I'll never invest in certain types of businesses is, now your ability to affect the outcome goes away because you've just taken yourself out of the conversation entirely. So I think that sometimes people are a little bit too extreme about their perspective on this, and I think that part of what you're trying to do is affect the outcome in who you interact with, who you engage with, and how you engage.
Final question, Mike. You've been very generous with your time. You have kids, I have kids. I know your son has been playing around with video, trained as a videographer. A lot of kids have enormous ambitions to be pattern breakers, and I'm sure many of the people who read your new book, Pattern Breakers, will be entrepreneurs or want to be entrepreneurs. What advice would you give, maybe not your own children, that's a little too complicated, but what advice would you give someone in college, thinking of going to college, getting out of college, who wants to be a pattern breaker? What's the best way of going about it? Do you need to work on your personality? Do you need to study a certain subject? Do you need to read TechCrunch every day?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. Almost all of them that I've met, and this is a little bit earlier than college, almost all of them that I have met, there was something in their life that was defining before age 14, where they pursued a project that they were wildly excited about for no reason other than they were just deeply interested in it. And so I think that one of the problems that we have with kiddos today is that we raise them to build their resumes, and we tell them, if you want to go to the best school, you need these activities, these grades, and their time gets programmed for them, and before you know it, they don't have time to pursue things that are interesting for their own sake. But almost every great founder that I've met and worked with, every pattern breaker, had this gumption, this drive at a very young age to do things not because it helped them get ahead or it helped them get into a good school or helped them achieve status in any way, but because it was just interesting in an obsessive way. And so I think as parents we can encourage our children to do that, because it's that type of project of one's own that breeds the independence of thought, that causes people to, you know, explore the unexplored. And that's what we need to do more of, right? We're too often we're teaching kids to learn to paint by doing a paint by number kit, or by following a certain recipe, or by having the answer that they're supposed to have. And I think we need to do more to allow kids to play like when they were really young, when they were just kicking the soccer ball around. They weren't worried that much about what direction it was going to go or where they were going. And so I think we need to encourage more of that, and when we see it, help them understand why that's a good thing, rather than that's a waste of time, do this other thing that's going to help you get ahead.
So you're pattern breaking parenting, Mike. Are you suggesting encourage our kids to be obsessive, maybe go into tunnels rather than escape them.
I think so. Yeah, and I think that you only have one life, and your time is a gift. You don't know how much time you're going to have, and so you might as well honor the gift of your time by engaging with the world in ways that are wildly interesting to you and that allow you to discover the undiscovered. You're never going to get your time back, so you might as well make it count.
Well, you're never going to get that hour back, Mike. We appreciate it. You not only a very successful entrepreneur, now you're a successful writer, Pattern Breakers, Why Some Startups Change the Future. You wrote it with Peter Ziebelman.
Yes, sir.
Congratulations on the book. And I'd love to get you back on the show again in the not too distant future. We need to talk more AI, big tech, and startup culture. Mike Maples Jr., thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.